Professor of Sociology. I'm director of the Center for the UCLA Center for the Study of International Migration, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's event. As many of you may know, the center has a regularly scheduled speaker series that meets every Friday from 12 to 1:30, where we discuss a broad range of books on a broad variety of migration topics. But in addition to these Friday events, we've been scheduling a series of Wednesday events to engage with a variety of different migration issues. In some cases, we've tried to connect with migration via different genres. So earlier in spring, we had a concert. 2 weeks ago, we had a screening of a film. But in addition, we've tried to engage with important aspects of the migration reality that go underexplored or haven't received the attention that they deserve. And so that's the underlying motivation for today's session, which concerns the H-1B program, which is commonly thought about or described as America's high-skilled guest worker program. And we'll talk about the realities of that in a moment with our three panelists, but I just want to say a few words about how we got here, because it's the story's a little unusual, and the answer is a bit embarrassing, because the origins lie in an email that I ignored. I received in early February an email from a student asking me whether I would read a paper, and you can imagine I'm in the middle of a very busy teaching quarter, and the last thing I want to do is read a paper from a student I don't know. And the student's persistent, so he sends me a follow-up. And that is enough to finally trigger my conscience. I opened up the email, I look at the PDF, and I said, wow, this is an incredible paper. I can't believe a UCLA freshman wrote it. But perhaps more importantly, it seemed to me that the paper shone a spotlight on a very important aspect of this phenomenon that is too rarely discussed. And the spotlight focused on really the human dimensions of this program that we commonly talk about as a guest worker program. But in a way, that concept is misleading. That's what the paper shows, because the so-called guest workers, in fact, come to the United States with families, with spouses and children. In fact, most of this population consists not of workers, but of families. And they come under visas that are formally classified as non-immigrant visas, but in fact, the reality is that of an immigrant life, that is of an effort to make a home in a new place and put down roots. But the very nature of the program makes that so terribly difficult. So I thought that this was an opportunity to focus on the human dimension of this experience, but to do so in a way that would situate the discussion within a broader intellectual context. So for that purpose, I'm very pleased to have been able to enlist two very distinguished scholars, Professor Hiroshi Motomura, who's a professor of law at UCLA Law School, and Professor Sabrina Balgamwala, who's a professor of law at Wayne State University School of Law in Detroit. And they will open up and end our program. So Professor Motomura will provide a broad overview of temporary worker programs. Professor Balgamwala will then focus more tightly on the H-1B program and other related issues. And in between, we're going to hear from this remarkable UCLA student, Yuteshwar Atri, who will talk about his own experience. So we'll hear roughly about for 10 minutes from each speaker, and after which we'll segue to questions and answers. You can send me questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll read the question and we'll pose the issue to the speaker. And so without further ado, why don't we begin? And with Professor Motomura. So Hiroshi, floor is yours.
Thank you, Roger, and thanks for everyone here, and thanks really for organizing this panel. I mean, I think it's fair to say that there's so many different issues in immigration that are hot topics today that I'm glad that there's attention paid to this one as well. So here's what I want to do in 10 minutes or less. Just two things. One is just give you a brief overview of how temporary workers fit into U.S. immigration law. Do that, but I think in this, what I mainly want to do is to try to unpack why people disagree about temporary workers. In other words, just kind of take a 30,000-foot view of the debates and see what are the sources of disagreement. But first, let me just give you a sense of how temporary workers fit into admissions categories in the United States. And Sabrina can go into it in somewhat more detail, focusing on H-1Bs, but this is the way it looks. US law divides people who are non-citizens into two categories for the purpose of being admitted to the United States legally. One is the people who are deemed or categorized as immigrants, and the other is people who are categorized as non-immigrants. Those categories are very fluid, actually, as Roger alluded to, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But there are lots of different categories of non-immigrants: students, temporary workers, tourists, investors, all kinds of categories. And the one that we're focusing on today is so-called, quote, skilled, end quote, H-1B category, and that requires, generally speaking, college degree. And it is distinguished from other temporary worker programs that do not necessarily require a college degree. So in that latter category are agricultural workers and also non-agricultural workers who don't have the education that you typically see in H-1B category. It's often the case that H-1B status follows F-1 student status. And so in some ways, there's a path for students to then become H-1B temporary workers, and then there's also the category for spouses and children. We'll be hearing more about the so-called H-4 that allows H-1B workers to bring family members. And so this is something that requires an employer petition typically, and there are annual limits on the number of H-1B approvals that can be granted. There's some exceptions to the limits, so the limits are not as rigid as it might seem, although it is a scarce commodity. And one thing that I think we're going to be talking about, this is the part that Roger alluded to, is that the temporary worker status, well, it looks like it's a non-immigrant status. In fact, there is in practice, a pathway to lawful permanent resident status from the H-1B. And so many people in the H-1B category, they come for an initial period of 3 years, extendable up to 6, but that can be extended even longer. And non-immigrants in the H-1B category are regarded as being allowed to have so-called dual intent, which means that they can stay as non-immigrants, but at the same time, they can pursue opportunities to stay in the United States in one of the admission categories for immigrants, which are often employment based. Okay, so and then there are other categories that are related that could be in some cases seen as alternatives to H-1B. People who work for a company can transfer from outside the country to inside the country. There are other related categories for people who are involved in trading or investing, and we can talk more about that later. But I just want to give you a sense that H-1B workers are technically non-immigrants, but in fact, many of them do become immigrants, and as Roger said, make a life here, and a lot of it is what that life looks like and what the transition is like to being a permanent resident. A permanent resident, sometimes called a green card holder, this is the status of being allowed to stay in the country indefinitely, and typically eligibility for citizenship 5 years after getting a green card, or it could be 3 years if you're married to a U.S. citizen. Okay, so let me go beyond that and just suggest that I think there are 4 different ways that people think about temporary workers in general, and I think a lot of the disagreements that people have about temporary workers often reflect the observer's orientation or perspective on what temporary workers are. So let me just list 4 of them. And this is just kind of a preview of some of the debates, I suppose, that one could have about this. I think one way to think about temporary workers is to think about their role in the domestic economy. And this has different angles. I mean, one is that, keeping a talent pool of international students in the United States, attracting a talent pool into the United States from outside, whether or not they are educated here. And what happens is that then you have debates arising from disagreements or guesses or maybe empirical work on what are the effects of this on the domestic economy. Is it a talent pool? A lot of people say yes. And in that sense, a real bonus to the American economy, but there are people who also think that this creates winners and losers. And so there are economists who spend quite a bit of time and energy determining whether or not the admission of H-1B workers actually lowers labor costs. Um, and is that a bonus for the American economy, or does it actually hurt U.S. workers? And so there are people who strongly object to H-1B status because of the wages and work effect on wages and working conditions of U.S. workers. And there are, of course, people who think that there are the sources of wage stagnation and the causes go far beyond temporary workers and immigration, but have much more to do with automation and globalization in general. But so I think one way to think about temporary workers is, what is its domestic impact? And are there ways, if there are winners and losers in the American economy, among workers, if they're winners and losers, is there a way to equalize that in the same way that is often stated as a goal for international trade? Okay, that's one. The other way to think about temporary workers is really to step away from domestic economic effect and really think about it in terms of how people become immigrants and people become Americans. There's a view here that all temporary workers are in some sense troubling, I suppose, as a category of admission, because why not just admit people permanently? Is the risk is, are you creating an underclass of people to come in and work without really giving them the promise of a green card and a path to citizenship? And so that's the fear, that you invite workers, but you get people, as Max Frisch once famously said. And any idea that you're bringing in people, but you just use their labor and then send them home, is inconsistent with the idea that if you're going to have borders, they ought to be consistent with fostering equality on the inside. So that's one objection I think that people often make to temporary workers, but it's more complicated than that, because there are others who believe that finding or admitting temporary workers is actually a very good way to determine who really ought to be allowed to stay. In other words, it's sort of probationary, I suppose. But that reflects kind of a view that, okay, we're going to let people come in as students, temporary workers, but we are going to create a path to citizenship. So it seems like an oxymoron, but it's really not. To say that, well, we're going to have temporary workers with a path to citizenship. And there's actually been legislation proposed but not passed that would actually make this transition much more in the normal course of things. And so another way to think about this, temporary workers, is not a domestic economy effect, but really, is this a way to choose immigrants? And what does that transition look like? I'll mention a couple other things. That's the second one. I'll mention a couple other things that are equally important, but may apply less to the H-1B category and the college-educated temporary worker, as less to that than to temporary workers in general and undocumented people in general. But this is a third way to think about temporary workers, is that it's not just the domestic economic effect, and it's not just a path to citizenship effect, but this is really an aspect of international economic development. In other words, here you have issues like, what's the brain drain sorts of issues? Is there brain drain? I think there's a lot of controversy about the very phenomenon of brain drain. Are we taking the best and brightest away from the countries that send temporary workers, or are we actually creating transnational networks that down to the benefit of both countries over time? And so that's a different way. There's a third way to think about temporary workers. What is its role in international economic development? Back and forth, is it circular migration? It's often said with regard to undocumented workers, but I think it's a valid way of thinking about temporary workers in general. So economic development. And I'm just about out of time, so let me just give you the fourth one. And a fourth way to think about temporary workers is not in relation to immigrant admissions, but rather in relation or in comparison to unauthorized migration, to undocumented immigrants. In other words, is admitting temporary workers an alternative to tolerating or acquiescing in, or even inviting, unauthorized migration? And this is, I think you hear this more in the context of temporary workers in general, not just H-1B, but I just want to point out that this is a different way to think about temporary workers. And I think a lot of the people who are favor temporary workers often do so because they're saying, well, really the alternative isn't just admitting people with green cards, but the alternative really is to have more unauthorized migration, and temporary workers are an important part of a response to unauthorized migration. So again, you have different perspectives here, effect on the domestic economy, how do temporary workers relate to the path to immigration and citizenship. Another one is what's the role of temporary workers in international economic development, and is this a response to unauthorized migration? So let me just stop there and let me just as an overview and pass it along. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much, Hiroshi, for this wonderful and succinct and very thoughtful overview. And now I'll pass the baton to Jiteshwar Atri, who will shine light on the human dimensions of the experience that Professor Motomura has just described. Jiteshwar.
All right, sounds good. Give me a second just to share my screen. All right, so thank you again, Dr. Motomura. Really appreciate just the overview. I'm going to be talking more about like the specific sort of lifestyle that a lot of high-skilled immigrants actually live in the United States. We were talking about like temporary workers. We were giving an overview, like different perspectives on temporary workers. And now this is where my personal story comes in. And I think it can really help, I guess, shine a light on how temporary workers are treated in the United States by the government, especially, of course. So yeah, so as I'm telling my story, I want you guys to look out for a couple things in particular. First of all, I want you guys to sort of look at the visa and green card policies that I described, and then really sort of try to weigh their pros and cons. Just try to see like what could be some potential problems that the visa and green card policies that I talk about might lead to. And then second of all, I just want you to look out for sort of disparities regarding like how different people are viewed through the lens of the immigration system. So like, for example, how someone from one country might be viewed differently than someone from another country by the immigration system. So yeah, with that, I'll just jump right into the story. So this story revolves around an incident actually that took place, I think 2 or 3 years ago. I was a junior in high school at the time. And me, my mom, my dad, and my brother, we decided to take a trip outside the country to visit India, actually, which is the country of our heritage. It was my mother's college reunion. And, we were just planning like a short 2-week trip. It was supposed to start in the beginning of my winter break and then end towards like the end of my winter break. So yeah, just a short 2-week trip. That was the original plan. And yeah, so there was only one problem, and that problem was that we had to get a visa stamp if we were to re-enter the country. So there's two different things. There's the visa that lets you stay in the country, right? That's the H-1B visa that we alluded to earlier. My parents had to renew that every 3 years. That's just like the protocol. And I'm their dependent, so I have the H-4 visa. So whatever status my parents have, my visa would reflect that status. So if their visa are approved, mine are going to be approved. That's just the way like the H-4 visa works. So this visa lets you stay in the country, right? But it doesn't let you necessarily enter the country. So that's where you needed the visa. That's where we needed the visa stamp. So if we left the country, it didn't matter that we have like this visa that said we could stay here. We actually needed a specific stamp that actually let us re-enter the country, right? And yeah, this stamp you could only get at an embassy or a consulate abroad, and you had to go through a visa interview. You had to like be interviewed by a visa officer, and then at the end, the visa officer tells you like, okay, yes, I can give you the stamp, or no, I can't give you the stamp, right? So, I mean, but the thing is, we already talked with attorneys beforehand, before we even decided to go on the trip, and all the attorneys we talked to, they pretty much said the same thing, right? Like, you guys really shouldn't have any problems getting the visa stamp because, you've lived here for like 12 years. At the time, it was 12 years. I mean, you've lived here for 12 years. You have your homes here, your education, like the children's education is here. you have jobs here, like it really wouldn't make any sense for them to deny your visa stamp, right? Just to re-enter the country, especially considering how you have the actual visa that lets you stay in the country, right? So as I'm sure you could probably guess, that's not exactly what happened. My mom went first for her visa interview. This is actually the first thing we did as soon as we got to India. We went to the embassy, made sure to get our stamps, right? My mom went first. Her visa was approved. My father and I, we were together for the interview. My brother, he's actually a citizen. He was born here. So yeah, my younger brother, he didn't have to accompany us. But yeah, my father and I, we were together for the interview. And the visa officer actually approved my father's visa and denied my visa, my visa stamp. And no reason or timeline was given by the visa officer. Um, it was just, it was really very confusing to us at the time because both my parents had their stamps given, but me, I'm their minor son who's dependent on them. And for some reason I was singled out. Like it really didn't make a lot of sense to not deny the 17-year-old son his visa when both of his parents' visa stamps were approved, right? So yeah, I was just denied on the spot. Well, I was temporarily denied, and that's like my last point here. There's this in between phase between being and that's called administrative processing. So either the officer approves your stamp or they deny your stamp, or you're given like this in between phase called administrative processing. And that's basically them saying, you know, we don't have a permanent decision yet, but we'll sort of get back to you whenever we can, and then we'll let you know from there. So as I'm sure you can imagine, this really took a toll on our outlook for the trip. It really changed our sort of attitudes. We were really looking forward to just enjoying our time in India, and then you know this happens. Like none of the attorneys expected this. No one expected this. I mean, and to make matters worse, like I said, no reason was given for why it was denied. No timeline either. So it was really, it really was shocking. But yeah, so the aftermath. We actually ended up having to wait 3 months for my visa stamp to be approved. I mean, my parents, both of their stamps were already approved. So, I mean, they had to go back to work, right? They couldn't wait indefinitely for my stamp to be approved. I mean, they had jobs to keep. They told their employers, you know, it would only last, you know, the trip was only supposed to last 2 weeks and they were running on 2 months. I mean, they had to go back. They had to resume their jobs. And they actually also filed a lawsuit against the government for unnecessarily delaying my visa stamp. And thankfully, the judge actually sided with us. And yeah, after a month of being on my own in India, I was with my grandparents, so it wasn't too bad. But you know, I had to learn online. You know, I was getting assignments mailed to me from school, so it definitely wasn't, of course, an ideal scenario. So I mean, the judge did side with us. My stamp was approved, and then you know I came back as soon as my stamp was approved. So for some conclusions, I know I didn't talk too much about green card policy, but I will here. So I mean, if I did have my green card, if my parents had their green cards, none of this would have happened, of course, because you don't need a visa stamp or anything to like re-enter the United States once you leave. I mean, the green card just lets you basically come in and out whenever you please for the most part. So if we had our green cards, I mean, this wouldn't have happened. And I guess that kind of raises the question, well, why didn't we have our green cards? And the answer is kind of complicated, but a sort of simple way to look at it is there's a limit to the amount of green cards any one country can receive. So the limit is actually the same no matter which country you're talking about. So a tiny country like Sweden, right? Their limit is going to be the exact same as the limit for a huge country like India, right? Or China. So this limit is the same, but as you can imagine, that's not, it's equality in on paper, right? Like, oh, the limit is the same for everyone, but in practice, you can see like countries with huge populations whose workers commonly, you know, immigrate to the United States, that cap is just not going to cut it, right? But if you're like from Sweden, right, and your population is small, you don't have too many immigrants coming to the United States, of course that's going to be more than enough, right? So it's called a per country limit, and the per country limit, like I said, is the same for every country. That's the real reason that my family had to wait so long. It's because we were immigrants from India. So in effect, the country of our birth really dictated how long it would take for us to get our green cards. And this is only under the highly skilled immigration category. I think I think there might be something different for like, you know, family immigration or stuff like that. But I'm just going to speak out what I know for sure. And that's like, this is the protocol for high skilled immigrants, right? And I mean, it really doesn't make any sense. Like if you have like a family like ours, right? You know, we're tax paying, we have our homes here. My parents, they're both in the healthcare field. So they're literally like, you know, saving American citizens' lives, right? But it's just the country just does not give us our green cards, which frankly, I think we deserve. And it really doesn't make sense that, you know, if we were from Sweden or like Norway or any other tiny country, we would have had our green cards in 6 months. And instead, it's 15 years now and we still don't even have our green cards. So there's definitely that per country limit is definitely something that needs to be looked at. But yeah, so that's a little bit about the green card policy, but that shouldn't take away from the visa policy. I hope some of you guys were able to recognize like sort of the hypocritical nature of the current visa policy. So, I mean, I talked about how you had a visa that lets you stay in the country, but then you needed a stamp that lets you enter the country, right? That really doesn't make too much sense. I mean, if you already have like the visa itself that says, yes, you can stay in this country, it really doesn't make sense for you to also need a stamp that just lets you enter. And also, yeah, it is unreasonable. Like the visa policy is unreasonable. I mean, how can you not give the person any reason for why their visa stamp was denied, like in my case? And how can you like not even give a timeline, like, oh, you know, we'll probably make the decision in like 2 to 3 months, right? I mean, my parents, I mean, after waiting 2 or 3 months, right, we weren't just going to wait around forever, right? We had to do something. So we filed a lawsuit to get our stamp given as soon as possible. That really was the only option we had. We couldn't just wait forever, basically. Also, I just want to compare my situation to my brother's. I can't work. I can't do paid internships. I can't even receive, you know, federal financial aid for college just because I wasn't born here, right? But my brother, I mean, just because he was born here, he can do all those things, right? And it really doesn't make sense. Like we're literally siblings. We're blood siblings. It doesn't make any sense for, I guess, the government to view us so differently, right? And I didn't really view myself as being different from other students in the United States, you know, in my high school and my middle school. You know, I just kind of viewed myself as being like, you know, the same as everyone else. But obviously the government doesn't see it that way. The government still, you know, sees me as an outsider. And I didn't really think of it that way until this trip actually happened. So, I mean, lastly, you know, I remember the first thoughts I had as I left the airport, like I was in like the crowd of people, you know, waiting in line to like receive their luggage and stuff. And I just noticed, you know, all these people have just basic rights that I don't have just because I wasn't born here. And I hope that from my incident, you guys were able to tell a little bit more about like the actual lifestyle that many of these temporary workers have to live, and many of their dependents have to live as well. So yeah, that's about it for me. I really appreciate your guys' time in coming out here, and I'd be happy to take questions at the end.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Jiteshwar, for that very eloquent presentation. And now we will give the floor to Professor Balgamwala, who will build on the comments from our two panelists. Sabrina, go ahead, please.
Thank you. So we've heard a little bit about temporary worker programs from Hiroshi, and Jiteshwar, I really thank you for sharing your experience, because I think it really highlights the pain and the fear and the challenges of what it means to have a temporary status in the United States. And I think there are really two levels to this problem. The first is just this concept of the temporary worker, which I think Hiroshi highlighted really well. And then there's how our notion of family fits in with this notion of temporary workers. So to build on that observation, we asked for workers, we got people instead, got people and their families instead. And that's really the problem that derivative visa holders face. So we have the principal visa holders. These are the H-1Bs, highly skilled immigrants. And then we have the H-4 so-called derivative visa holders who are spouses and children who have status that derives from that principal. And we think about that familial relationship as being about family reunification. But given the limited limitations on people's rights that they have as derivatives, I've come to really think about derivative status as a legal fossil. It less resembles our contemporary notion of family and more resembles a very old but very entrenched idea about family members, like spouses and children in particular, as property. And I wrote about this in the context of spousal derivative visa holders from the perspective of the legal doctrine of coverture, which was a huge force in Western law through the mid-19th century. This idea that a woman's legal existence was extinguished when she got married, and her personhood was incorporated into her husband's identity. And so she would lose her independent interests and autonomous rights. And this resulted in the lack of ability to work because you can't contract for your labor if you're a non-person. It affected women's ability to maintain citizenship of a particular country, and also for people to maintain custody of children because women were seen, children were seen as property of the husband in the family. And so I argued that the rights of non-citizen women have really been overlooked in immigration reform. We saw coverture start to exit US law starting in the mid-19th century through a series of reforms, but it really persisted in the area of immigration law. And women during this time period were forced to assume the nationality of their husbands. They would lose their own, the nationality of their birth. And as recently as World War II, women traveled on their husbands' passports. So family immigration law in the 1920s was an extension of this idea. It gave male citizens and permanent residents exclusive control over the legal status of immigrant wives and children. And there was no reciprocal right actually for women to petition for husbands. And so this dynamic where the principal controls the immigration status of derivatives is the basis of our present day process of petition and also of the derivative visa. And so the emphasis on the principal visa holder, the H-1B, is so extensive that the US government doesn't even track the demographics of derivative visa holders, only principals. And as with early immigration laws, a derivative status hinges on either a marital relationship or a parent-child relationship. And that parent-child relationship under immigration law ends when a child turns 21 or gets married before the age of 21. And Jiteshwar, again, I thank you for sharing your experiences and being so outspoken, because I think there's some consciousness around the gendered aspects of immigration, especially through the lens of domestic violence awareness. But these policies are affecting people who entered the United States as children, and it's receiving a lot less attention. But I'm sure that's going to change with your advocacy. So we've seen a lot of consciousness raising around the experiences of Dreamers and DACA recipients, but that's really only one small part of the experiences of people who come to the United States as kids. And there is a provision that was intended to address children of principal visa holders or principal status holders called the Child Status Protection Act. It was formulated to address backlogs with US visa processing, which is its own problem and its own Gordian knot, really. But it doesn't address this long wait that employment-based visa holders, particularly from high sending countries, as just Teshwar mentioned, the per country visa caps make the wait time extremely long. And so we see a lot of people aging out, and this is really incompatible with our ideas about families not only remaining together in the United States, but also equality among people in the family. And if there's an interest in retaining H-1Bs, which is a temporary status, but there is a path to citizenship, then it really does behoove us to think about how these policies affect everyone in the family, not just well, first of all, two levels of reform, I think here. We really have to rethink these employment-based visa programs, specifically this temporary status, because it creates its own problems for people who are in liminal status. There are all kinds of processing nightmares that can happen to any people, and that wait time is so incredibly long. But then thinking also about family members and the rights of those family members that reflect our contemporary notions of equality within the family and the rights of families to remain together. So that's the extent of my comments. I'm interested in questions.
Oh, okay, terrific. So thank you so much. So why don't we segue to questions or comments? As I indicated earlier, you can send me a question in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll read the question. At the moment, there are no questions. So let me pose the first question. And that, in a way, picks up on the last point that few points that you made, Sabrina. I mean, in a way, Cheteshwar was very lucky in that he's living in California, and so as a result, as a California resident, he's able to qualify for in-state tuition. But I would imagine that this is not true throughout the country, so that there must be many people like Cheteshwar who've spent their entire youth in the United States, graduate high school, but then all of a sudden turn into international students with very limited options. And I'm wondering whether you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So it's true that in the absence of recognized status for people on a national level, that states have produced policies that allow folks who, especially these young people who age out of their status or maybe never had any formal status in the United States, to all kinds of things. So you mentioned access to in-state tuition. Many states have passed these so-called their state dream acts that create access to tuition, but also important things like driver's license, state IDs, all these other things that people need in order to go about their daily lives. And this is a problem for H-4 derivative visa holders. Not being able to access, so the tuition piece you mentioned, but having derivative status affects everything from your ability to get to open a bank account because people don't have independent credit histories, and also people's ability to leave relationships they don't want to be in. So we see actually that there are a number of barriers and obstacles as the result of having that status, and states can do things to make the experience better.
Okay, so let me see whether we have a comment from Professor Minjo, who has her own, let me see whether I can, hold on, I want to let her talk. Here we go. Okay, Min, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you for all the panelists. And this session is, very much to my own experience too. And thank you, Cheteshwar, for sharing your experience of your H4 experience. I want to add to your experience from the perspective of an H-1B holder, um, to talk about the precarity that that highly skilled immigrants are facing. So years ago, I was talking about that in the early 1990s. I'm Chinese, so I had an H-1B, and so I applied for green card, as you said, um, and now the waiting time is longer. So when I got the when I applied for the green card, and I was waiting for the um, the wait time was was unlimited. There was no timeline. They just asked us to wait because we have to wait for our visa numbers to come up, and that per country visa at that time requires that we wait for 2 to 5 years, and now it's more than more than 10 years, I think, for Indians, and it's even longer. So we just wait, right? So we waited forever. And so the point I want to make is, while you are waiting, you lose your H-1B status because you are applying for green card, and your green card is already processed, right? So you just have to wait until your green card gets approved. Now, for my case is more complicated. And at that time, I have a 10-year-old son, and then my husband is on. He at that time he was on an F visa, not on an H4 visa, but my son is. So so I was basically illegal, at a legal limbo. So I was given, because I am in the process, right? So I was out of status, but I was given a work permit. I'm eligible to work. And then my son, basically, he was out of status. And then the decision came down when we received. I was like, my green card was denied. So I have 90 days to have a voluntary departure. Now, the first thing that came to me was family, right? For myself, I can return to China, no problem. But what about my son? So that's immediate to my mind, and that adds to my anxiety and a lot of things. So that experience, and later on we resolved the issue. But that experience suggests that being a temporary worker, and Roger says it right, there is a human dimension to it. You are not just a worker, you are also part of a family. You are a human being, you are part of the family. So if you lose that status, that affect your whole family, your children, who never knew that 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 like my child was foreign born, but he never knew that he was an immigrant, or he was a foreign born. And when I talked to him, he was shocked and stunned. And I guess psychologically that had an impact on him too. So that's one. And then the other one is the status, right? A lot of immigrants waiting. You are at a legal limbo. You are actually out of status. I'm not saying undocumented, out of status. And if your green card application is rejected, then you only have this 90 days for voluntary departure. And then for 90 days, it totally turn your life upside down. So I really share your experience as a child. As a dependent, I was kind of the principal visa holder. So I guess that 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 adds to the story. I just want to share that personal story. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so very much, Min, for sharing that, and an excellent illustration of the extraordinary problems that this visa system can create. And for those who in the audience who don't know our speaker, Professor Minjo is a very distinguished sociologist of migration. You can just ask yourself, what would have happened to the sociology of migration had she been forced to return to China? Fortunately, that didn't happen. So let me now, Hiroshi would like to add to the discussion. Go ahead, Hiroshi.
Yeah, just three quick thoughts that are triggered by various things that I've heard. The first one goes back to what Jiteshwar and also Min just mentioned about her own story, and that is that if you take a real step back from the system that we've created, there's a spectrum here, and on one end of the spectrum, people get status, people get green cards, if or citizenship for that matter, if they run the gauntlet and essentially prove themselves through not just qualifications, but also through perseverance. That is one way to run the system. But one can imagine a system that is more set up to make it to see the granting of legal status not as the merit badge you get at the end of a series of harsh tests and delays, but really set up in a way to make it as to facilitate, coming to the United States, facilitate a path to citizenship. That's a very different way to think about it. And I think oftentimes the way the system is set up is to create more of a test environment, as opposed to the government saying we will do our best to create a stronger country through welcoming immigrants. So that's one point. The second is that when Jiteshwar was talking, I made me really think about, if you realize that your access, for example, to financial aid as you get through high school and think about college, things like that are, obviously not just disruptive, but really kind of shocking if you didn't know what the status was. But I just want to point out that, anyone in this country who is undocumented has that same experience, and even more so, right? Because it's not just that they have a temporary status, but that they really are under threat of immigration enforcement. And so I just want to say that there's some commonalities between temporary worker status and the undocumented, but the undocumented situation is a more extreme one. And yet it may come from the same kinds of mismatches between the economy and legal status. The third thing I just want to say quickly goes back to Roger's question to Sabrina, which is, what's the state role in all of this? There's tuition, in-state tuition, but there are so many interventions that states make to push back against federal immigration status. So as she mentioned, it's not just in-state tuition, but it's also driver's licenses and all kinds of things, including public benefits. And it's an interesting historical dance between the federal government and the state governments. And what we're seeing is that I think if it were up to the state of California, there would be a push to expand educational access, but and also immigration status. But it's really, I think, largely to not just advance and strengthen communities inside California, but also the economy in California. So you have this mismatch between, I think, economy that is often thought of as regional, state, or local, and an immigration system that is national, where states have a voice, but it's a limited voice in national policy. So that's just a tension that has been around for really ever since the Republic was founded.
Okay, terrific. We have a limited amount of time remaining, so let me pose the same question to both Hiroshi and Sabrina, and that is, let's, in the hope that we're headed towards a better world, let's assume that sometime during the Biden presidency there will be comprehensive immigration reform. And should we be so lucky, what should that reform do about this program? To what extent should there be continued temporary high-skilled immigration? And if that is to continue, how could it be configured in a more just and equitable way? So we have about 10 minutes. So why don't we start with, go to Sabrina first, and then come back to Hiroshi, and then perhaps with those responses, we'll wrap up the program.
I should be more used to answering this question. in terms of like how would you change the immigration system? I think that what's one of the things that really stands out to me as a theme in this panel is the problems with making distinctions among Americans in waiting, that there are people who are undocumented, there are people who have temporary status, and there are, in the midst of this, there's all these caps related to countries that create different kinds of backlogs. And I think that the most powerful reforms are those that don't make distinctions between people, especially historically, our immigration system has been driven by categories of desirable versus less desirable, and that a truly just system would avoid making those distinctions and value people in a more equitable way. And so that is my hope, is that we see actually multiple pathways to status open up as a result of a reform effort.
Okay, terrific. Hiroshi?
Okay, well, you're inviting me to be the person who decides everything, right? At least for hypothetical purposes. And so what I think about comprehensive immigration reform, which of course is a big topic that's being debated everywhere, but certainly in the halls of Congress right now. I think that one of the things that has been a historical problem in the United States has been a disconnect between the economy and the immigration system. And so we see this in larger and in small ways, right? And so what Jiteshwar talks about with regard to medical professionals, I mean, it's certainly there are barriers, not just immigration barriers, interestingly, licensing barriers as well to getting medical professionals into the United States in legal statuses. But that same phenomenon is true for all kinds of people whose labor seems to be needed in the United States. Whether it's in farm work or we've now come to call essential workers. And more generally, building up a talent pool inside the United States. And so I think that there needs to be for example, a greater way for people to come to work, to the extent that the alternative would be to not be allowed in, or to come without papers or to overstay. So I think that's one thing that's important. Another thing that's important, I think is important is to understand that the United States is part of a larger, obviously a global community, and that it's important to give people both the option to come to this country, but also the option to take advantage of opportunities in their home countries. And we may see this less with so-called skilled workers, but I think in workers in general, I think that we can't be in a situation that essentially the United States goes around attracting and being a magnet for all the skilled workers and inducing them to leave their home countries. I think there has to be some international cooperation and development to allow people to go back and forth. So that's another thing. The other thing that I want to mention, because and this is the thing that's least talked about, but I think it's important to talk about, is that I think that it's important to take seriously at least the political view that temporary workers depress or retard or inhibit the increase or improvement of wages and working conditions of U.S. workers. I think this is often dismissed, and it's often dismissed because I think the macroeconomic literature suggests that immigration is a net gain to the economy as a whole. But what I'm afraid of is that the perception that there are winners and losers, and there's some losers, and those losers are being hurt by immigration. That may not be true in sort of the sense that of economists proving this. Although this is something that's actually quite contested among economists. But I do think there's a political liability here, and so I think it's important that any comprehensive immigration reform, if it's really comprehensive, is going to need to look seriously at things that are analogous to international trade adjustment assistance, and say, okay, if you think there are too many H-1B workers, there are ways that we can share some of those gains that, for example, in the IT industry are gained by having temporary workers, and to force IT companies to share some of those gains for even things like retraining programs and things like that. So this is not often talked about, but I think that what I'm really saying is that a lot of what is talked about with regard to comprehensive immigration reform isn't really all that comprehensive. And I think that the political bandwidth to deal with these issues of international economic development, of a really serious correction of the disconnect between the economy and the admission process, and then really how to think about this in terms of sharing the gains more equitably from immigration. Those are things that would make immigration reform truly comprehensive. I'm sorry that's such a long answer, but it was a big question. And there you go.
Okay.
That's the short version of my answer.
All right, terrific. So we've just about come to the end of our time. So I want to thank our panelists for participating in this event and for their very thoughtful contributions. So thank you, Sabrina, Hiroshi, and especially Prateshwar, and thanks to our audience for engaging with us today. I want to remind everyone that we meet every Friday from 12 to 1:30. We have 4 more talks, including this Friday. And but a very interesting book called Driving While Brown, which is a treatment of of Joe Arpaio and the pain and punishment he inflicted in Maricopa County, and how the residents of Maricopa County in the end got rid of him. So thanks to everyone. Pleasure to spend this hour with you, and hoping to see you at one of our other events. So bye-bye.